Our guest today is Professor Christopher Starr. Dr. Starr is Professor of Classics at Middlebury College. He is also Associate Director of the Axxin Center for Humanities at Middlebury College. Dr. Starr's current research interests focus on eschatology and accounts of global catastrophe. He is the author of Empire of the Self, An Introduction to the Life and Works of Seneca, and the topic of our discussion this afternoon, Apocalypse and Golden Age, The End of the World in Greek and Roman Thought, which is a book that I cannot recommend highly enough, and we'll get into that. So, Professor Starr, welcome. It's an honor to have you on the program.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I look forward to us sharing the contents therein with the audience. So when we discuss apocalypse today and the end of the world, eschatology, in other words, more often than not, we tend by default to think of it within the Judeo-Christian matrix. However, you argue that Greek and Roman authors often speculated on different scenarios of catastrophe, destruction, and return. So tell us more about this.
Yes, that's right. Apocalypse, we think about the end of the world, especially apocalypse, as a specific term usually applied to Greek and Roman texts, the two texts that are in the Bible, Daniel and Revelation. And that can have a specific, there's a lot of debate about what an actual apocalypse is. A lot of it literally means an unveiling or revelation, usually about ideas or visions of the future. And then, of course, right, usually those visions of the future are about world destruction. And I think some of the main difference, though, in Greek and Roman ideas about the end of the world is in some ways, it's not specifically a revelation. A lot of times it's about philosophers, as we'll see. A lot of times it's philosophers using reason and the study of nature, as opposed to getting this divine message that they may not understand revealed to them. They themselves will do the revelation and the uncovering. That's a key idea about Jewish and Christian apocalypses. They usually have a mediator, a divine mediator, or an angel or something between humans. Greeks and Romans generally didn't think that was necessary. And then I think an interesting thing, too, is the temporal differences and also connections. One being generally another way to define apocalypse is sort of a temporal period. And most scholars will say that Jewish and Christian apocalypses date from about 200 BCE to 200 CE. The Greek apocalypses can start even earlier with Hesiod around 700 BCE with his talk, and we'll talk more about Hesiod, about Zeus's plan for the current Iron Age. And then Plato as well, writing in the 4th century, and also the Stoics and Epicureans being some of the main philosophers writing prior to that period. So in some ways, the Greeks and Romans were thinking about how the world might end earlier than what we think about as the biblical apocalyptic tradition. But then there also is a lot of overlap, and this is especially true with the Roman authors writing at the end of the Roman Republic, people like Lucretius and Cicero, and Stoic authors like Seneca and sort of Stoic author Lucan writing at the end of the Julio-Claudian period, the Emperor Nero, right, a time of crisis for the Romans. So there's some interesting overlap as well, because Nero, an important figure in Revelation, also is the background for what Seneca and Lucan have to say about the end of the world.
And I think that's really key there. What you really emphasize in the book is that while the Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature and thought matrix has a scope that focuses on the end of history, very often the Greek and Roman authors, or actually more so the Roman authors than the Greek ones, tended to look at the end of history and see it through a lens of how they live their lives in the present. From a philosophical point of view. So I think that's key there as well.
That's right.
So you just mentioned him, and let's start with Hesiod because he goes way back to, pretty much Homer.
Right.
So Hesiod is an author who utilizes the well-known trope of the Golden Age. How did he convey this thought in his writings?
Yes. So Hesiod, in my book, and also to my mind, at least, this idea of Greek thought about the end of the world really starts with him. like Homer, we're not 100% sure when Hesiod, his poems were written down. Some people think about 700, if you need it, 700 BCE. So again, in the archaic Greek period, he's writing in Boeotia in mainland Greece, a bit north of Athens. And his two main works are the Theogony, the birth of the gods, and then the Works and Days, which is more about the human realm and how to live a good life. And towards the beginning of that poem, he gives an example of an explanation about why life is so difficult for humans. First, he tells the story of Prometheus and Pandora, right? Things are difficult because of the theft of fire and Zeus's anger at Prometheus. But then he says, well, if you like, I'll tell you another story. And it's not 100% clear how the two line up. And he says, I'm going to tell you a story about the myth of the metallic races. And there's a lot of debate about where Hesiod is getting this idea. Is it from the Near East? There are other, parallels that we can see in other religions. But at least for Greek and Roman authors, Hesiod was sort of the inventor of this idea. And what the myth of metallic races is about, and it tells, is these multiple creations and destructions of humanity, which brings in sort of the cyclical thinking that most people talk about how characterizes Greek and Roman thought. But Hesiod has an interesting twist because we're not really 100% sure what Hesiod thinks is going to happen after our age. So just briefly, first he says there was this golden race, and Hesiod usually uses the Greek genos. It's the Roman authors who later speak more of, and they can do both, but they speak more of an age, an aitos. So Hesiod speaks of specific races, literally, of humans. First, the golden, where everything was perfect. There was no work. They did die, but they died as if overcome by sleep, he says. And these lived under Kronos, right? This is the time before Zeus. They die out. Again, they don't really die. They sort of fall asleep. And then they become blessed spirits, Hesiod says. Then there's a silver age, or silver race, and this is when we can see the transition sort of coming to Zeus. They are not pious at all. They don't honor the gods. Zeus gets angry at them and destroys them, and this becomes sort of a theme to think about. Eventually, what happens is there's a bronze race that is incredibly violent. They destroy each other. Then we have this things. It seems like things are getting progressively worse, but then we have the age of heroes, the Homeric age, the Argo, that period. And then finally the Iron Age that we're living in. Hesiod predicts that Zeus will destroy this age, and even gives a sign to look for: babies born with gray hairs around their temples. But before that happens, he predicts things are going to get even worse. And then eventually Zeus will destroy the age. So it's unclear, though. Hesiod never says what's going to come next. The myth seems sort of self-contained. Perhaps this is the end of humanity, full stop. But this idea of Hesiod leaving it unclear what comes next really gets later thinkers, especially Plato and people like Virgil, thinking about, well, maybe the cycle can continue and the golden age can return after this destruction.
And let's just get into the pre-Socratics. Tell us about the catastrophism in the thought of philosophers such as Xenophanes and Thales.
Okay. Yeah. So what's interesting is that in my book, and what I just find interesting, as I was saying, that you can really trace this idea of various catastrophes, various scenarios, right? Hesiod already sort of starts things going, right? It's not sort of like the biblical idea that there's going to be one end. Hesiod has sort of 5 different ends for these different races that he imagines. They're all different, right? The golden age falls asleep. The silver race is destroyed. The iron race perhaps will be destroyed. And what's fascinating is that, of course, right, Hesiod, we think of him as the realm of myth. But he really gets picked up by the philosophers. His thinking about this idea of cyclical birth and death of humanity becomes to be a real focus of, as far as we can tell, in some pre-Socratic philosophers, and then, as we'll see, also specifically in Plato. So the pre-Socratics, or sometimes they get called the first philosophers, or probably even more appropriate, the natural philosophers, the physiologoi, as they got called in Greek, were, as the name implies, they were interested in studying the role of nature in the world. And what they were most famous for, too, is coming up with the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And then I should also add, the early atomists were part of this group as well. So they argued that atoms were the building block of the universe. And so Thales is seen as sort of the first one of these thinkers, and this is in the 6th century, in the 500s. And he focuses on water as the primal element. It's not 100% sure if he believed in a future flood, but Xenophanes certainly does. Xenophanes, who's writing a little bit later, but in that same area, says that the world has been covered by water, and it's going to be covered again by water, and this is how humans get reborn again. And what's fascinating about Xenophanes, again, we only have fragments and reports of what these people wrote. It's not until Plato that we can get really full accounts of this vision. But Xenophanes, at least according to the testimony of him, even offered evidence. So we can see that these people are a bit like scientists or a bit like archaeologists. He says, well, I have proof that there was this flood because there's fossils of seashells high on mountains, or people have found fossils of fish down in caves. And so he imagines, like Hesiod, that this is a cyclical process. But unlike Hesiod, the pre-Socratics and a lot of later philosophers don't really imagine Zeus or a god behind this. This is just sort of cycles of nature. Another thing of the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus argued that instead of water, he argued that fire was sort of the primal element. And some people think that, again, his fragments are very obscure, and he was known even in the ancient world as being dark and hard to understand. One fragment may imply that the world will be destroyed by fire and maybe even judge the world by fire. Some people think maybe it's a Christian interpretation. Some people think the Stoics took their idea because the Stoics argued that there was cyclical destruction by fire, that they are picking up on Heraclitus. So it seems, as far as we can tell, that the pre-Socratics, these first philosophers, did pick up a bit on Hesiod about this idea of cyclical destruction, but they take God or gods out of the realm and think more about the forces of nature, the forces of water, the forces of fire. And then even the atomists, just to throw another person in there, Democritus, the early atomists, they believed in multiple worlds, and that, like the Epicureans, who we'll talk about, that really just death is just dissolution of atoms. And Democritus supposedly said that worlds are destroyed or by worlds crashing into each other. So if you've ever seen Lars von Trier's movie Melancholia, where the planet, I don't want to give away the end, but it's about a planet headed towards Earth, and it gives a very vivid account of how humans might react to that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, especially when you were giving a survey of the natural philosophers, and I found it fascinating that they were looking at their environment around them. They were looking at fossils, they were looking at the landscapes, and they were like, this is my proof. It's like almost like a geological kind of proof for their philosophy. I just thought that was great. But of course, as you mentioned, the Greek philosopher who meditated the most on catastrophes and the near destruction of the human race the most was, of course, Plato. He explores these themes most fully in four of his late dialogues: Statesman, Timaeus Critias, and Laws. So tell us more about this.
That's right. These are really fascinating works for a lot of reasons, and one being that, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that the story of Atlantis is contained within this, in the Timaeus Critias. It's part of Plato's larger exploration of this theme of terrestrial catastrophes. So, as you rightly mentioned, there is some debate about how to divide up Plato's corpus, but most people think that maybe there's sort of early, middle, and late periods. And these dialogues, the Statesman, Timaeus Critias, which are in a sense companion dialogues, and then the Laws, which most people think is his final dialogue, are self-consciously, in some ways they're about political philosophy. Timaeus Critias is about cosmology as well, at least the Timaeus. But a lot of ways, especially the Statesman and the Laws, are about political philosophy, and they self-consciously are looking back at the Republic. The beginning of the Timaeus talks about a discussion that was a lot like certain parts of Plato's Republic. So what's interesting in these dialogues is Plato is self-consciously sort of revisiting what's come to be his most famous dialogue and bringing in the role of nature, the power of nature to shape human development and to shape political development specifically. And we can see what Plato is doing if we sort of trace these visions, is that Plato is sort of playing with and exploring different ways that human development can be checked, I guess, and be at the hands of the forces of nature. And he starts off with this very surreal and I think self-consciously unbelievable story of in the Statesman about how the cosmos spins in one direction at some times, and then at other times the god lets it go and it spins on its own. And this, he says, is the alternating too between the time of Kronos and the time of Zeus. So there he really sort of talks about a return to the golden age, picking up on Hesiod. And he says that when the world starts spinning in different directions, there's sort of this intermediate period that creates earthquakes and a lot of destruction and death of not of all humans, but of a large number of humans. And that really sort of gets Plato going. And he, in the Timaeus Critias, he picks up on this idea and he puts it in a little bit more believable way. He starts thinking more what we would talk about as natural disasters affecting humans. And so Plato, like Aristotle, doesn't believe in the death of the entire world or time stopping. He thinks that the world is eternal, but he does think that there are these terrestrial catastrophes that ravage the globe periodically, fire and water being the main ones. He brings in disease sometimes, and then he sort of ominously says there's many other ways. And so these are these terrestrial catastrophes, perhaps natural disasters. It's unclear if the gods send them or not, or if it's just sort of part of the globe, sort of hardwired into just the way the world works, that we have these periodic destructions. And so, as I said, in Timaeus Critias, he talks about the story of Atlantis, which sunk beneath the waves during one of these destructions that happened about 9,000 years ago, he says. So that's the key thing to think about, that Atlantis is part of this larger theory that Plato's interested in, and that how humanity is constantly sort of pushed back and destroyed. Atlantis is just one example. Athens was also affected by that. And he does note in the Timaeus that Egypt, though, is saved because of the Nile. The Nile is able to protect it. In the laws, he doesn't offer any place that's protected. He sort of says that any place can be destroyed. So we can see Plato sort of looking around and thinking of different types of scenarios. And the key thing to remember is that basically what Plato says is that all advanced civilizations are wiped out. So, for example, a flood, he says, only illiterate shepherds, pastoral peoples in the mountains are going to survive it, and they rebuild society again. So there's no limitless technological progress. There's sort of this idea that humanity is always pushed back, and we always are able to develop only so far before one of these catastrophes hit.
Right, everything has to be rediscovered again over and
Right.
over, and it's really interesting. Plato's catastrophe models are very interesting because it also relies on this concept of almost like a natural explanation. Like, well, people who live in the hills live higher up
Yeah.
than the people in the cities, so it's a very interesting way of going about it. And I also find it interesting that in this dialogue, the Timaeus, like who's relating this story of Atlantis
Right.
is an Egyptian priest, right? So it's almost like
Right.
a revelation from a holy figure in a way, if you
Yes.
want to look at it from
Yes.
a strictly apocalyptic standpoint of revelation by a
Good.
heavenly or holy figure. So, and of course, the stranger and the
Good.
statesman. So it's
Good.
always very interesting to look at it from that sense.
Good.
And as you mentioned, yeah, it's very Plato and Aristotle did believe that the world was eternal, and so that's why I think Plato focuses more on the catastrophes and the natural disasters than just the complete burning up of the world.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah. So thank you. I'm glad you bring that up. At the beginning, I sort of said, well, there's this dichotomy between, biblical revelation. There's this divine mediator, a special, person, and the philosophers are using reason. But Plato definitely plays with that, this idea that he does have these mysterious figures. It's never Socrates, right? Talking about these, it's strangers, or it's an Egyptian priest, or it's a long lost sort of manuscript, or poem that someone is remembering. So absolutely, Plato definitely picks up on this sort of this what becomes a key apocalyptic theme, and we see it in Lucretius as well too, with Epicurus, even though he's a human, sort of bringing back this divine knowledge. So definitely that
Right.
theme is there.
Yeah, absolutely. And audience, I'm going to wholeheartedly recommend all of these texts, but especially these Roman authors, these Latin authors, because you cannot get more metal than some of these end of the world scenarios that you will find in Lucretius and Lucan and Seneca. So let's get into it. So the writers of the Roman Republic. In the book, you focus on two men and their vastly different philosophical and narrative understandings of the end, Lucretius and Cicero. So tell us a little bit about Lucretius's thoughts on the end.
Okay. So yes, Lucretius, you can't get sort of more fascinating and more important than his poem De Rerum Natura. On the nature of the universe, it usually gets translated. Stephen Greenblatt wrote over 10 years now a book, The Swerve, about how important sort of the rediscovery of Lucretius was for during the Renaissance and starting sort of the modern world. Because what Lucretius is doing is he's, in a sense, as we've hinted at, studying nature, using science to sort of understand the world. But Lucretius, who's an Epicurean philosopher, so he's a Roman, he's writing in Latin, and he's writing Latin poetry at about 55 BCE, towards the end of the Roman Republic. So Rome's in crisis. Caesar's going to cross the Rubicon and start another series of civil wars in 49 BCE. So Lucretius is perhaps writing at a bit of a lull before that happens, but he is picking up on almost a 300-year-old philosophical tradition that started in Athens with Epicurus, and picking up even further back that I've mentioned a little bit, the atomists. So the Epicureans believed that all the world was made up of atoms and void. That's all there is. That's the ultimate nature of the universe. And there's this swerve that makes atoms come together. It's a random thing. There's no divine hand before it making it happen. There's no providence. And that creates multiple worlds, that creates rocks, that creates rabbits, that creates humans, that creates the human soul. And then eventually, right, these things will break apart and dissolve. And so one thing Lucretius is very interested in is one, and this is a key Epicurean idea, is curing the fear of death. Because death for the Epicureans is nothing to us, they would say, because it's just dissolution of atoms. The soul is not immortal. The Epicureans believed in gods, but they believed the gods lived in the so-called intermundia, sort of in this special world, almost like a golden age world where nature supplied everything to them. And they don't care about humans because they're gods. They have a perfect world. Why would they care about humans and sacrifice and things like that? They don't need anything. Nature gives them everything. So they do believe in gods. They're not atheists, but they don't think there's any punishment, and they don't think there's anything for us to fear. And so what Lucretius does in this poem, in two key points, is he really sort of draws this connection between, okay, don't fear death because there's nothing to fear. And it's also a natural process. Not only do humans die, not only do animals die and plants and non-human life, but our world is going to die as well. So he sort of, brings it out to the macro way of looking at things. And what's interesting about Lucretius, though, is on the one hand, he's convinced that the world is mortal, and he goes into great detail trying to prove it. So he's arguing against Plato and Aristotle about the eternity of the world. He goes at great lengths to prove it, but he's not 100% sure how it will end. And so here he really gets into these different scenarios, whereas Plato said, well, it could be fire and water and things like that, but that's only terrestrial destruction. Lucretius says, well, maybe the fertility of the world is just going to wear out, and people will sort of slowly die, and life will slowly die out. So it'll be sort of this gradual decay that just sort of ends things. And here I should also note that he's sort of writing against Epicurus himself, because Epicurus did We don't have a lot of his work that survives, but we do have a brief account of how he envisioned worlds ending. And he says it's when their envelopment sort of dissolves. Perhaps he's talking about the atmosphere or something, that everything just will scatter into the void. But Lucretius is sort of much more earthy and sort of very Roman. And he has this great image of, these people who don't understand Epicureanism, these farmers getting angry and thinking it's because they're not pious anymore and they should pray to the gods. And he says, no, it's just a natural process. The earth is just slowly losing its fertility, and presumably eventually it'll, entirely lose it. But then in book 5, he offers another example. And it seems that, maybe he's a bit unsure. Maybe he doesn't want to, basically give a prophecy, sort of, so to speak, about how the world is going to end, the specific form it's going to take. Because then, and here's a real sort of, he's one of the first people, I think, at least in Greek and Roman tradition, to say, maybe we'll witness it. This could happen soon. And he says to his addressee, Memmius, maybe we'll witness the end of the world. And in one day, it'll all happen and we'll see earthquakes and everything shaking the world. And he says, I hope it doesn't happen. I hope we can just talk about the end of the world and not actually witness it. So Lucretius is interesting, one, because he has two scenarios, the gradual decay and the one day scenario, one day of destruction. And then he's the first to say, and this is, a key theme of Jewish and Christian biblical narratives, that, it's coming soon. We're going to see it, perhaps.
Yeah, it's fascinating just how dark it is, but also he really is. You wouldn't think at first that this was like an apocalyptic text, but really is. He is using a lot of the themes of the heavenly kind of revelation, maybe not in the sense of an angel, but also a philosophical revelation in a way. And that leads us into the next author, Cicero,
Yeah.
who's writing about the same time. So tell us how Cicero conveys the end of the world in his work De Res Publica, and the last portion, The Dream of Scipio.
Right. So this is really fascinating because we can see, it seems, I argue, and I think, I think it stands on good ground, because Cicero himself, in one of his letters, says he's read Lucretius's poems. It's a little unclear what he's talking about. It's most likely, I would argue, De rerum natura, is that we can have two people, we can see this debate about how the world might end and the extent of it, and whether it's cyclical or a final destruction. So Cicero, of course, most famous for being a great statesman. He was consul of Rome. Lucretius, we don't know anything about Lucretius. The Epicureans advocated for a life in secret, a life away from politics. All we know about Lucretius is the poem he wrote. But he did want to reach out to the political world by writing to Memmius, who was a high up person in Roman politics at the time. And we know that Cicero read him as well. And so Cicero's De Republica, on the Republic, as you may have guessed, is in some ways a conscious sort of response to Plato's Republic. And he's looking at, sort of the ideal state. And of course, for Cicero, ultimately, the ideal state is Rome. But he realizes Rome's in crisis. And in a lot of ways, his book is about how to cure this crisis and how to deal with the problems that Rome is facing. And of course, one of the main problems that Rome is facing is aristocratic ambition, right? Elite Romans thinking they're above everyone else. Pompey and Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar being sort of the main players at this time. There had been others before them. So that's one thing that I think Cicero is very worried about, is that there are people, right, who think they're Roman, but they think they're better, and maybe they think they deserve a little bit more, and maybe they have autocratic and ambitions. And I think that's one thing, sort of the psychology too, that Cicero is trying to cure, right? To get people to think about the collective good over their own personal good, and that is sort of underlying throughout the text. And I think that's one thing that Cicero is responding to Lucretius, one in a positive way, where I think he appreciates the Epicurean view that you do need to study nature because it sort of shows how small you are in the larger scheme of things, that the study of nature can give you a bigger picture or a cosmic viewpoint, as it's been called, with reference to the Stoic philosophy as well. So Cicero was not an Epicurean. He definitely is against Epicureans. He's very clear. He comes right out and says it in specific points in De Republica. And he's not a Stoic. Also, he was a skeptic. He was an academic skeptic, I think, is the best way to think about it, in that he leaned toward the Platonic view of things, but he was also skeptical. He didn't think maybe there was one truth. But the influence of Plato really comes through in his dream of Scipio, where Scipio Aemilianus Africanus, I should say, the person who sacks Carthage in 146, is the main interlocutor of this text. And he talks about this dream that he has. And again, we have this very revelatory and revelation idea where he journeys up into heaven and he meets his adoptive grandfather, Scipio Africanus. It's a little confusing. They all sort of take these names: Scipio Africanus, the defeater of Hannibal, and the winner of the Battle of Zama, the end of the Second Punic War. Scipio Aemilianus, who's the main interlocutor and who has this dream, is the winner of the Third Punic War. So this is definitely tied into Roman history and Roman politics that he's thinking. So he has this dream where he journeys up into heaven. And basically, again, what he realizes is how small Rome is and how small the world is and how beautiful and perfect the cosmos is. And I think one of the visions is to have sort of Rome mirror this perfection, or try to mirror the perfection of the cosmos. So again, it's an orderly cosmos, unlike the Epicurean random cosmos. But what he does have, also learns from his father, is about, again, this is the idea about checking glory and checking individual ambition, is that his father tells him, he says, well, yes, you should strive for Rome, but don't think your glory is going to live forever. And don't think your achievements will be remembered forever. And here he brings in the Platonic idea, but he takes it sort of to the extreme. Plato says humans survive these catastrophes. Scipio Africanus says there are going to be these catastrophes by fires and floods that happen at fixed time, and then all memory is wiped out, right? And by extension, I think you can imagine Rome. He is imagining Rome will come to an end. So I think that is sort of his way, sort of taking Plato. He's responding to Lucretius, the world survives, but he also sort of accepts Lucretius that, there is going to be a full-scale destruction of humans, but then things are going to start up again, coming back to Plato.
Yeah, it's really really awesome how you showed the intertextual play between those two, and kind of the discussion going on that Cicero is responding to Lucretius. And I didn't put this in the agenda, but I felt it's important to mention, because as I told you backstage, you were recommended to me by John Collins. And John Collins knows a thing or three about these Sibylline oracles.
Right.
And you mentioned in the book that it wasn't just these imperial Roman writers. There was also the third Sibylline oracle, which discusses the same kind of concept as well. So I
Right.
didn't know if we could touch upon that shortly
Sure.
before we go on to people like Virgil and Seneca.
Great. Well, I think that the Sibylline oracles, I think, will make a good segue into Virgil. Okay, so the Sibylline oracles, interesting, sort of fascinating corpus that has come down to us today. It's a mixed corpus. It was written over a period, probably again of centuries, from maybe 200 BCE on into the Common Era, centuries into the Common Era. They're written in Greek. And they're Jewish and Christian, ultimately, authors. But what's interesting is that these Jewish and Christian authors are adopting the figure of the prophet of the Greek and Roman world, the Sibyl. There were many Sibyls throughout, these prophets throughout the Greek and Roman world. Probably the most famous, if you've ever read Virgil and Virgil's Aeneid, right, the Sibyl of Cumae. And so the Greek and Romans had this tradition of the Sibylline books. A lot of times they'd call it, and they would be consulted for, in times of crisis and things like that. So we have a lot of stories about the Sibylline books being consulted in Rome. A lot of them were lost. We don't really have the actual what the Romans had. But what springs up at the same time is, as I said, Jewish and Christian authors pretending and writing oracles in the style of the Sibyl in Greek hexameters. And a lot of times they are incredibly anti-Roman and offering predictions that Rome will fall, Rome will be destroyed, and then it's sort of more in the biblical vision of then they'll become an eternal kingdom, God's eternal kingdom. So it's interesting to think about that these oracles likely, could have been circulating in Rome during this time. And throughout the Greek world, especially a lot of times they're sort of anti-Rome from the East, Alexandria, Asia Minor, and things like that, people resenting the rise of Rome's power. And so some of the earliest, I think the third oracle is the earliest, and we think it's written ultimately by a Jewish writer, sort of responding to the rise of Rome and predicting the coming fall of Rome at some point. And just to tie this in, we're not 100% sure if Cicero and Lucretius may have known about them. They certainly knew about the Sibyl and the Sibylline oracles and the Sibylline books. Whether or not they knew about the specific ones that we have today, we don't know. But we can see, and here's an interesting connection, right? Whereas, Revelation and the Sibylline oracles, another, sort of apocalyptic text that didn't make it into the Bible, is predicting the fall of Rome. Lucretius, is in a sense predicting the fall of Rome and predicting the total destruction of the world. And Cicero is as well. Cicero is predicting, he says, don't expect your glory to last forever. Don't expect your name to be remembered forever, because, he never comes out and says it, but by extension, if you read between the lines, he's also predicting Rome's decline. So that's an interesting sort of connection between the two, that we have these elite Romans imagining Rome's end, and then we have these nameless outsiders, from the margins, it seems, of the empire, angry at Rome and predicting Rome's demise as well.
Thank you for that answer. And yes, it's extremely important. And I think even in Phlegon of Trolley's book of Marvels, like he has some kind of these texts where these kind of anti-Roman or anti-Hellenistic
Right.
apocalyptic kind of pronouncements are being given. And he actually has a couple of Sibylline oracles, like legitimate Sibylline oracles. How he got a hold of those, who knows? But we'll move on from the late Republic into the early Imperial period, because this is very important to set up actually what's to come. You have Virgil, Ovid, people like that, but especially Virgil, who return to the concept of the return of the Golden Age. Most famously in Virgil's fourth eclogue. So how is it different how Virgil uses the Golden Age imagery from earlier iterations in the poets such as Hesiod?
Okay. Yeah. So fascinating question. So to come back to what I was saying earlier on, how we can really trace these ideas and how they change and how they respond in some ways to the politics of the time. Whereas at the end of the Republic, we have Cicero and Lucretius really being pretty pessimistic about the future of Rome, how soon it may come. It's never 100% clear, but, sort of like apocalyptic literature, from outsiders, Jews and Christians, they also seem to accept that Rome will one day be destroyed. That changes, though, with poets like Virgil and Horace as well, and perhaps Ovid too, during the, what will become the Augustan period, sort of the so-called Golden Age. It still gets called that today, of Latin literature. There comes to be sort of this less a focus on destruction, but bringing in these ideas from Hesiod, from Plato as well. This hope that, as Plato surmises in The Statesman, and as Hesiod, leaves unclear, that maybe the Golden Age can come back. Maybe after a terrible period of Iron Age destruction, that the cycle can start again, and it can start again in with the Golden Age. And that's something that Virgil famously, whether he believed it or not is a huge question, and whether Augustus himself believed it, and whether the Romans themselves believed that a new Golden Age was starting. It's a little bit doubtful, but we do, it's undeniable that we do get these proclamations. Virgil 1 in the Aeneid, where there's a prophecy in book 6 from Anchises, Aeneas's father, where he points to the future Augustus and says, this is the man who will refound most likely the Golden Age in Italy. But the real famous first time Virgil mentions this return of the Golden Age is in his fourth eclogue, the first group of poems Virgil wrote. And here, what's fascinating is that he's writing it in about 40 BCE, before Octavian becomes Augustus, before Octavian is really sort of that powerful. And most people think actually this poem is more sort of praising Antony, and Antony's marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia, and hope that with this peace between Octavian and Antony, that a new golden age might come, and that this child that's born to them will hopefully start this new golden age. And the most famous, and in some ways, sort of, I don't know if misunderstood or creatively interpreted these lines. So here he talks about the final age of the Sibyl, the final age of the the Sibyl of Cumae has come. But then, right, instead of saying this is the end, he brings in this idea of cyclicality. And he says a new order of the ages is born. Novus ordo seclorum, if you've ever looked on a dollar bill, the Great Seal, the new order of the ages. There it is, this idea of societies starting again and being new. And he predicts that a child is going to be born, and starting at least probably around 400 Christian authors reading this saw this as a prediction of the birth of Christ. So it's about 40 years early, if Christ is born around the year 1, something like that, this is about 40 years earlier. So people, Christian authors, especially in late antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages, and even until fairly recently, thought that maybe Virgil was inspired, or through reading through the Sibylline oracles, he came across this prediction, right? Going back to Isaiah, ultimately, about this Prince of Peace being born.
So let's get into the main events of the show, so to speak.
Okay.
Like I said, these two authors explore, they kind of give the apocalyptic imagery with the best of them. They give the book of Revelation a run for their money, as far as I'm concerned. Of course, I'm talking about Seneca the Younger and his nephew, Lucan. So tell us about how Seneca explores eschatological themes and scenarios in philosophical works such as his Natural Questions 3, and in his literary works such as his play Thyestes.
Okay. Yeah. So Seneca, if you had to pick just one person from the ancient world, I've talked a little bit about, it's just, you can, small passages in Plato, small passages in Lucretius and Cicero, but when you get to Seneca, it's just everywhere. So we have a lot of the Senecan corpus, and it's in his philosophy, and also in one of his tragedies. Seneca famously or sort of controversially wrote both Stoic philosophy and plays. Whether those are Stoic or not is up for debate. So Seneca is a fascinating sort of transitional figure from sort of this hope that Virgil and Horace and perhaps Ovid also express under Augustus, that maybe it won't be an actual golden age, but maybe right out of the destruction, out of the cataclysms of the Civil War, we'll get this renewal. Seneca lived under all of the other Julio Claudians, right? Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and then Nero. Nero being, of course, the central figure here, tying him in, and Lucan, his young nephew, into Christian apocalyptic thought, right? Nero as sort of the beast of Revelation, the Antichrist, most likely, as he comes to be seen in later times. So Seneca is fascinating because, as I alluded to, he's a Stoic philosopher, and the Stoics did have a theory of cyclical destruction by fire, but then rebirth. Eventually, they're never 100% sure. They never say it's going to happen soon, but they have this theory of, if the world is ultimately governed by fire, eventually it's going to run out of sort of food to feed it, and it will consume everything, and then sort of water will come back, will become the next primal element, and everything will grow out of water. That's the basic Stoic idea of ekpyrosis, conflagration, and palingenesis, rebirth. The Stoics, the Greek Stoics, we don't have very much of their works that survive, like the pre-Socratics. There's only fragments, and we have only sort of very sketchy accounts of this theory. Thanks to Seneca, however, he writes in great detail about these destructions. But he isn't just sort of this orthodox Stoic basically saying, well, there's going to be fire and conflagration and there's going to be rebirth. He gets really elaborate throughout all of his philosophy. So it's not just in response to living under Nero, living at sort of this end of the age. Nero's the last Julio-Claudian emperor. Seneca didn't know that. He's forced to kill himself 3 years before Nero himself is forced to commit suicide. But you do sort of get this sense in Seneca that he's living in a world that's sort of on a breaking point, because although in some of his early dialogues, his early consolations to Marcia and to Polybius, he writes about how thinking about the end of the world can be sort of a cure, sort of like Lucretius, that, understanding that everything dies can be sort of a psychological comfort when a member of your family has died. Thinking about that death is this law that governs everything, and it's even going to govern the world itself, right? But there will be rebirth from the Stoic view, for the world at least. So in his early dialogues, he does sort of talk about these ideas as a form of personal consolation. But as you mentioned, in Natural Questions 3 and in Thyestes, which are most likely written under Nero, late in Seneca's life, when he's realizing Nero has descended into tyranny and there's nothing he can do to sort of help Nero. He was Nero's tutor and then his advisor. But eventually he realizes that Nero is completely out of control, completely beyond his control. So he sort of retreats into philosophy, as far as we can tell, and he writes an incredible amount of work. He writes his moral epistles, where he does have some apocalyptic scenarios in them. He writes his great study of nature, sort of, again, another response most likely to Lucretius, but here studying nature from a Stoic perspective. The world's guided by providence, not by random avoidance. And so at the end of, maybe to talk about that, in Natural Questions 3, which most likely actually was book 1, the manuscripts have gotten jumbled up, and we think from internal clues that actually what we now call book 3, with the manuscripts transmitted as book 3, was actually Seneca's first book. So it seems that he wanted to end his opening book, where he's studying the role of water, terrestrial waters in that book, with this vision of this flood to come, this cataclysmic flood. So already he's sort of, it seems to be going against Stoic theory, perhaps. He's not focusing on fire, he's focusing on water. And he says it's going to happen soon as well. He never mentions Nero. He does talk about Nero in Natural Questions, but he only praises Nero. He never sort of says things are going to come about, the end of the world is going to come because of Nero. But he does sort of bring in, as I said, most philosophers like Plato and Lucretius try to take God out, try to take morality out. Seneca is sort of bringing in morality. You do get this sense that, humanity has descended. There is, we've become so immoral. It's a bit like Hesiod. And eventually this cleansing of the world is going to come, and we'll have this rebirth. So he does picture this cataclysmic flood covering the whole world, and it's going to destroy all of humanity. It's a bit like Noah in that sense, but two major differences. He's envisioning a future flood, and he doesn't imagine that any humans are going to survive. He says all humans will die out, and he has sort of this sort of very gruesome detailed pictures of humans getting carried away by the flood, and then some humans, again, perhaps a trope on Noah and certainly on Plato, where Plato says humans are going to survive on mountaintops. Seneca says, yeah, some humans will flee to the mountaintops, but they're going to starve to death up there, and they're going to just be completely astounded. So he has this incredibly, really focusing on human suffering and, the psychological responses. And I think that's one thing Seneca is interested in, because maybe he did think the world was going to end soon, perhaps in his own lifetime, as Lucretius surmises. And as a Stoic, right, wanting to control the emotions, I think he is sort of imagining, well, what might be the emotional response? And so he looks at that, imagining how people are going to respond to the end of the world and face the end of the world from a flood. But Seneca, as I talked about, is also really interested in different scenarios. And he's not just interested in talking about the ekpyrosis. Here in Natural Questions, he's talking about a flood. And then in his play Thyestes, which is, again, perhaps some people think a comment on Nero. It's about this terrible tyrant who exacts this terrible revenge against his brother. He kills his nephews, he kills his brother's sons, and he serves them up in a cannibal feast. This is an old myth. And according to the myth, the sun is so horrified, the sun in the sky is so horrified by this act that it reverses its direction. Seneca takes that sort of this preternatural act of the sun's reversal and takes it even further. He imagines the chorus being so afraid and wondering, why did the sun reverse its course? Maybe it's not just one sort of reaction by the gods. Maybe that this is the end of time. This is the end of the world. And they have this really sort of this tour de force, this chorus where they sing, imagining, this. But ultimately, the focus is on the stars falling from the sky, the constellations falling in order. So on the one hand, it's this image of sort of cosmic catastrophe and confusion, but at the same time, the cosmos is going to sort of fall in order, right? He starts with Aries, right, and goes to Taurus, and imagining all of these stars falling from the sky. And again, it's the end of the world here, full stop. There's no vision of any renewal. There's no vision of anything coming after it. It is basically, right, time stopping. And the things we use to gauge the progress of the day and the year, the sun and the stars, have stopped as well. And of course, there's a biblical tradition, right, of the stars falling from the sky. It's in Isaiah and in the Septuagint translation, the Greek translation, and of course, it's in Revelation too. So, and it's in the Sibylline oracles as well. So perhaps Seneca is tapping into this idea of stars falling, or perhaps he's riffing on the stoic trope of things burning from the stars. But again, there's no rebirth. But he does imagine sort of the chorus being afraid, but then sort of being resolved at the end, accepting their fate, accepting that the end of the world may be at hand and that they have to die with the world.
Yeah, it's a chilling and beautiful chorus. I really think that it kind of speaks to the dichotomy of Seneca as a writer, both as a Stoic and as a playwright. Because as a writer, he's, like you said, trying to be very detached from emotions and being very stoic, but also in his plays, like you look at something like his Medea, and
Mhm.
that's like a Quentin Tarantino movie. All of a
Yes,
sudden, like there's so much blood, and like all of his plays are prone to insane outburst of violence and
right.
blood. So,
Absolutely.
uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, I know we're running low on time. Did you have time for one last question, Dr.
Yeah,
Starr?
absolutely. Yeah, I know you wanted to talk about Lucan, but go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, so my wonderful viewers, if you read any of these writers from what we're discussing today, please read Lucan. He is the most metal, dark, gothic writer of all of them. We've talked about him before with Daniel Ogden when we discussed the Thessalian witch Ericto
Mhm.
and necromancy. So if you want if you want witchcraft, if you want apocalyptic imagery, if you want blood and guts and gore, pick up Lucan, because this is a tour de force. So Lucan was Seneca's nephew.
Right.
His Civil War, uh, it far and away contains the most apocalyptic imagery um, of any of these Roman imperial writers. So tell us more about this.
Right. So yes, Seneca and Lucan were both met the same end under Nero. They were related. He was Lucan was very young, and he became a friend of Nero's. He was one of sort of the bright artists of the day, and supposedly maybe he fell out with Nero, perhaps because he was a better poet than Nero. And his one poem to survive, sometimes it's called the Pharsalia, sometimes it's called the Civil War, is again sort of looking back to, as we talked about with Lucretius and Cicero, looking back to the end of the Republic with Caesar's invasion of Rome. That's where it begins. Him crossing the Rubicon in Book One, in the Civil War between him and Pompey. It's unfinished, most likely. It ends in Book 10, but we can imagine, or at least I can imagine, Lucan and Seneca sitting around talking about different visions of the end of the world, because they're both interested in different scenarios and thinking about different ways the world can end. And in some ways, we know that Lucan studied Stoic philosophy, but like Seneca, he's not orthodox. He's not just going to say, well, there's going to be an ekpyrosis and then there's going to be a rebirth. Lucan, in his opening simile, he talks about, and he relates in a sense, the fall of Rome and the fall of the Republic to the eventual destruction of the world by fire. And he talks about, he calls about the final hour, when the final hour of the world is going to come. And he describes what will happen. And this is at the very opening of his poem. And it's also sort of problematic because here he does praise Nero in the opening of his poem. He does say, well, Nero, yes, I know it was bad. We had all these civil wars, but at least you got to be our emperor, if that was the only way the fates could have it. So he talks about how the end of the world and the end of the republic are related. There's no rebirth. And then another famous outburst he has in book 7, after Julius Caesar has won the Battle of Pharsalia, sort of his vision of the final view of freedom for the Romans. He talks about how, well, Caesar, you really haven't accomplished anything, because eventually, right, the world is going to burn in fire, and everything you've accomplished, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how Lucan takes those kind of golden age tropes you find in somebody like Virgil, but he's kind of ambiguous, ambivalent
Right.
in terms of. I know there's
Right.
not really a scholarly consensus on how serious he is when he praises Nero, but it's
Yeah.
very interesting how you can see him play with those
Right.
tropes in his
Right.
treatment of Nero.
Right. And he does say, so he does say, yes, we have Nero, it's so great. But he says, after you're dead, Nero. And this was always, always something to worry about. The emperors hopefully were going to become gods, but you always had to be a little worried about saying, well, I can't wait till you're a god, because that means I hope you're going to die soon. So, but Lucan does use golden age tropes, but it's only after Nero dies. He says, once Nero dies, then the world, will be at peace. Then we'll have, then there'll be no more war and things like that. So, he doesn't say that we're going to have a golden age once Nero's alive. It's only once Nero is up in heaven that the world will be at peace.
Absolutely. And just as an aside, he doesn't really fit into the categories that we're talking to, but another Neronian author, Petronius, also in his the Cena Trimalchionis, or the Banquet of Trimalchio, some scholars view that almost as like an underworld journey to a catabasis as well. It's
Point.
very interesting how Nero inspires all of these apocalyptic and dark visions. I wonder why.
It's fascinating. So absolutely, Petronius. So the big three, under Nero, the big three writers, Seneca, Lucan, and Petronius. They're all very experimental, especially with their poetry. Seneca writing tragedy, Lucan writing this odd historical epic with no gods, and then Petronius writing this, for lack of a better phrase, proto-novel. And although he doesn't have specific apocalyptic imagery, specifically talking about the end of the world, absolutely, it does have sort of this eschatology of the dinner with Trimalchio scene as this journey to the underworld, that they're living among the dead, that their lives are not lives at all, basically. And so, Nero, in some ways, the key to thinking about, and again, this is late apocalyptic literature in some ways. Daniel is already, centuries old. Revelation is responding to Daniel. Hesiod and Plato are already centuries old. But Nero, both among the Christian world and, interestingly, among the elite Romans who were living close to Nero, seem to also sort of see him as sort of this eschatological figure, this figure who's coming at the end of an age.
Absolutely, and he inspired, for better or for worse, some of the most interesting text of that time. I mean,
Yes.
The Trimalchio's dinner is a virtual Nequia book in itself. It's very
absolutely.
surreal. Everybody check out Lucan. Everybody check out Petronius, especially. Check out Seneca. Dr. Starr, it's an incredible book. I couldn't go over everything, obviously, and I know I left a lot out. You do a lot of cross comparison between contemporary views of the end of the world and these texts. So I wanted to give you this time to emphasize anything you feel we might have missed, or you wanted to talk about before we go.
Okay. Well, Well, thank you again for having me. This has been great to talk about my favorite theme, and maybe I will say, it may seem morbid to talk about the end of the world, and this idea of, what is it good for? Should we focus on positive things and things like that? I guess I would say, thinking about our modern world and our modern crises. One research I've done, is looking at how apocalypse, the word itself, is used more frequently in writing, in the press, and in writing. So in some ways, we're living in sort of this apocalyptic moment, and or at least it feels that way. And I think what's interesting about the Greek and Roman authors is, one, it sort of gives us another way of thinking about the end of the world in contrast to the biblical way of thinking. And one thing to think about apocalyptic literature, why it is so durable and why it has existed for so long, is because it is sort of, in some ways, I think all of apocalyptic literature, biblical and also Greek and Roman, as we've touched on, is training in resilience, training in helping you face whatever trials you're going to have to meet, whether they be personal or on a social level. And so I think that that's one thing. And there have been studies that have showed, in a sense that, I saw one headline from a psychological study, fans of apocalyptic films are dealing better with COVID and things like that. So I think there is some value to reading these texts and trying to gain, maybe not a prophecy about what will happen, but, as I said, psychological resilience and insight.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the apocalyptic literature and these post-apocalyptic meditations really are heavy in symbology that can help us make sense of our own present existence. And I think that that's what somebody like Seneca is doing. All of these writers are trying to make sense of their present situation through looking at the future proleptically, and
Right.
because them and us have the benefit of a maybe kind of hindsight that these texts reveal, because it's after the apocalypse. We can
Right.
make more sense of our existence in the present. Christopher Starr, this has been a complete total blast. I loved researching your book and researching these texts, and I highly recommend the book. The book is Apocalypse and Golden Age: The End of the World in Greek and Roman Thought. I put the link in the show notes and in the comment section. It's pinned at the top. Cannot recommend it enough if you're interested in eschatology, even if you're only interested in the Judeo-Christian matrix aspect of this thought. I really think it sheds a lot of light on the end of the world and the many ways it could happen, and how writers played with that imagery in antiquity. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Starr.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you all for watching. And until next time, y'all have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Bye.